The EU is a big mess. Hot take of the century right there. The idea of changing time zones within the same country is foreign to me. I mean, like, most of Europe operates under the tame sign zone. France is actually a country with the most time zones, actually, thanks to former colonies. I don't know if we should count that. I don't know if we should count former colonies. I think you're splitting hairs, Mr. Light. Only America gets to count distant territories as part of itself. Genuinely crazy that France still has a colonial empire. It is crazy, like, however you want to interpret it. On one hand, the fact that, like, actually has colonies. I don't know if they're still, like, technically called colonies. But I mean, if you really think about it, the imperial era and like colonization never really ended. We just kind of stopped calling it that. We tend to frown on these things if they're more direct. And like, if you obviously just directly have colonies and you call yourself an empire and you act like a warmonger. But we also have a tendency to overlook that we're not really that different in a lot of ways. And admittedly, it's more soft power these days than it is hard power. It's a lot more about controlling through money, right, than it is through actual military force, certainly. And like, yeah, sure, we're not like sending armies to go and conquer things anymore, but the amount of control that these quote-unquote former empires still exercise over these weaker powers is to such a degree that like, it's kind of hard to call it anything other than basically what it is, which is maybe not colonialism, but like imperialism, right? Exerting power over others. Maybe not through physical force, but certainly through intense economic pressure, let's say. The Eurozone, yeah, there's so much stuff that I am not familiar with. The EU is a big mess. Hot take of the century right there. It's a big mess, but it is quite cool. It is. Both can be true. And also leaving the EU when you have absolutely no plan and didn't really leave it up to a popular vote is arguably even more of a big mess. Not calling out anyone in particular, of course. No one's gonna sit here and pretend the EU is like thriving financially and it's like set to overtake America any day now, right? It's like the global superpower and it's entirely great and like everything is going perfectly. There's a lot of people who have a lot of criticisms about it. But when you think about it, both like, even just fundamentally, the idea that it's like a United States, but for nations instead of states, is kind of phenomenal. And the fact that it's been going on for all of these decades, it's not like currently collapsing like the USSR did. Clearly it's not doing everything right, but it's not doing everything wrong either, right? There's something that's working about it. And there's something that I feel like we could take from something like the EU, right? And not the similar thing that we would take from like the United Nations, the UN, which is like completely useless, right? It does absolutely nothing. But, like the EU actually like does things. It actually has an impact on the world, unlike the UN. And I can't help but wonder if we actually like put more of a lens on the EU, then like we could probably learn a lot more lessons with how nations like interact with each other, how we can potentially form coalitions, again, like a US, but for nations. There's certainly things we could like learn how not to do, like how voting works and how a lot of people just kind of feel like they're even more distant from the government because obviously the EU is like even more detached from the national government. Like there are lessons we could learn from it, right? And I think we're in such an attitude, especially these days, of like trying to tear down things that we don't like how they're working, because there's a lot of discontentment in the world and a lot of very understandable and very valid discontentment in the world. But that doesn't change the fact that there is a lot we can take from it if we actually start looking at the good, rather than just trying to destroy what is going poorly, actually looking at what does well and what could potentially do well if we adjust a little bit, and then actually try to apply it to the future, right? Like, you could argue political scientists are doing that right now. Obviously, they're analyzing everything, but like, we also have a society, right? We have that responsibility too. It's not just like political scientists and the people who are so far beyond us in those academies and those universities that are doing these things. Like, we are citizens, right? I'm not a EU citizen, but we should be the change that we want to see. So if we want to see something that's bad that we want to criticize, yeah, we shouldn't be afraid to do it. But we also shouldn't be afraid to say, hey, this thing is surprisingly not falling apart, right? We're in such a environment of like criticizing things and of trying to tear things down and being frustrated and wanting everything to change. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that's unwarranted. At the same time, I can't remember the last time I've seen people parading around politically about things that are going well, right? Like things that are going well with the EU. Like, again, the fact that it is a case in point that you can have a coalition of nations, in a sense, with a lot of standardized things and not end up like the USSR, right? I feel like we don't give enough attention to that even though it's not like thriving in an insane way. And yeah, I saw what Mr. Light says. You just want to overtake the US. I don't want your labor laws, for example. Yeah, of course. I'm just talking about like economically speaking, you know, as a global power. But like even if it's not thriving to the degree that, again, say like America is, for all the wonderful reasons that America is thriving, right? There is a lot of good we can take from it, a lot of good we should be taking from it. And just the fact that it's a case study that these kinds of things can work. Nations can work together. You know, these people who have, as Mr. Light is saying here, all these European prideful nations, not only prideful, but like literally historically at war, right? Europe has been one of the most conflict-ridden like places in history because of all these different like nation states that have been battling each other and like having all this bad blood. Look at France and Germany. But, like the fact that they're all working together to some degree and it hasn't imploded on itself entirely, we should like look at that and say, hey, maybe we can fix out some of the kinks, iron them out, but also like apply them on other scales and on larger scales. And maybe we can actually get out of the idea that politics and global politics in particular is a zero-sum game, because too many people are like in that mindset, and it's ridiculous, right? It is not a zero-sum game. Rising tide lifts all boats. But of course, there's just so much discontentment, and the world's not in a great place for a lot of people, so it's kind of hard to focus on the positives when things don't seem like they're going super well. So I know that's kind of like wishful thinking on my part, but even if it's wishful thinking and not like realistic, I think it's worth saying. I'm not a big fan of the EU law taking precedent over national law. I am a big fan of open borders and the free trade and such between them. And things like standardized currency, easy travel between the nations, right? Those are all some really great things. If you want to like move to another nation or just visit another nation, it's so much easier to do that than it is to like go from the EU to like say Russia or even to like the UK, right? So Living Dog does bring up a good point. That is something I mentioned before. The EU kind of taking precedent over a lot of national law. I mean, it is similar to the US with its states in a lot of ways, right? Ironically, in this current like political environment, it does backfire to a large degree because there is a lot of discontentment with governments, right? With like governments being distant and not being separate, being too separate from the people. I'm not entirely like educated on how European people view that kind of issue as opposed to like Americans. I know Americans, it's like really bubbling over. But again, having this like overarching government that's so far away from most of the nations it's governing feels like it's only really feeding the feeling that like the government is separate, right? That we don't really have a say, that they're kind of our overlords, that we're almost like colonies. But also like, what are you gonna do, right? You can't really have all these people working together without some sort of central meeting place at the very least where people can like talk about things. Scandinavia is even easier to get between. I can just take the train to Denmark whenever without thinking too much about it. People from Norway go to Sweden to buy groceries because it is cheaper. Wow, that is incredible. That is incredible. And that is a whole nother point. Like as an American, I could go on an endless rant about public transportation and how America is like so uniquely anti-public transportation, almost like aggressively, but almost absurdly anti-public transportation. So I've considered moving like to the EU several times for many different reasons. One of which just being to live in a Western nation that actually gives a shit about public transportation and isn't like designed around the automobile industry as the vast majority of America is. During my studies, I lived in a city where you can take the tramway to go to Germany. All the way, just go to Germany from France, just on the weekend. Might as well, just a weekend trip with your friends. Not a big deal. I should also say I don't think a state should exist, but I'm sort of putting that aside. Because I'm like, what's the fun in saying the EU is bad because the state is bad? Clarification, Living Dog, what do you mean by state? Are you referring to state as in like the United States, like those smaller states? Or are you referring to a particular state? As in like the state of matter, like water? No, but are you referring to like a state as like a nation state, because obviously like a state is a word that we use for very different levels, so it can mean many different things for many different people. As an American, obviously I have my own basic definition of it, but as Europeans, you guys generally probably have a different definition because you don't really have the states that we have. Well, Scandinavia has been at war for a lot of history. Sweden and Denmark have been at war a lot. We are basically now siblings as countries. I mean, spending all that time together, like, especially with all the craziness in history, like, especially in things like the 20th century, I feel like at some point you've got to build that camaraderie, right? If you've been together, neighbors, for that long and none of you have, like, annexed the other, and you both haven't been annexed by a greater power, like, at some point there's got to be some level of camaraderie that's building up there. State is a national form of government, I think would be a good definition. I think all laws should be reduced to the local community as in the city. Oh, interesting. So you'd actually go the opposite direction. You would say that far from like the EU, we should have like larger governments covering everyone. You think we should break down those larger things and have smaller communities. And presumably, I mean, I assume you're not against these cities, let's just say, if we're saying that as the body of government. I assume you're not against them having like representatives coming together to like discuss things between different cities. But like also, isn't that sort of what the EU is? That's sort of what these larger governments are, or at least what they're supposed to be. These larger bodies that have representatives from the smaller states that are supposed to have the actual power. Though I guess that's kind of been twisted out of that shape for quite a while now. Not all countries that have been at war for long have developed camaraderie. That's very true, some known. I mean, obviously, there are some nations, like especially a lot of Middle Eastern nations, that have just kind of been at war for basically ever, for like all of history. I mean, not that those states have existed for all of history, but like those generational wars and stuff. But I mean, when you have things like Scandinavia, and you have these places that have been at war a lot, but aren't like fundamentally opposed to each other, you know? Again, just referring as an example to the Middle East, like they have a lot of like religious and like deeply rooted cultural beliefs, right? That like almost demand the eradication of each other. And correct me if I'm wrong, but like Scandinavia and sort of Scandinavian countries don't really have that animosity with each other. I mean, I'm sure they've got a lot of like things they would like that the other person has. But like, if you don't have that bad of bad blood, eventually, like, people can only war at each other for so long, for so many centuries, for so many millennia, before at some point you're just like, we're just kind of in it for the long run, aren't we? We should just accept it at this point. Not to say that that's certainly always the case, but it seems like in certain cases that is how things end up happening. Even if it's certainly not a straight road to get there. I mean, heck, look at France and Germany. They've had a historic rivalry, right? Quite an intense rivalry at times, but look at the present right now. And really a lot of the European nations, there's a lot less animosity between them and like war between them than has historically been the case. And I don't think you can contribute that really to the EU. I don't think that would really stop people if they hate each other's guts. I think there is a certain degree of just proximity and of we haven't eradicated each other, and we probably won't eradicate each other anytime soon, so we might as well get along. And also, people are just naturally creatures that, like, you know, make bonds and get closer and get to know each other. And get to know each other even if it isn't through good things, right? I mean, as another extreme example, you have the enemies to lovers, right? Time spent together, even if it's time at war with each other, will eventually develop bonds of sorts. Won't always be good bonds, but a lot of times it can be. And you are going to develop feelings with people that you spend a lot of time with. And while these aren't people, these are obviously like generations, these are nations, these are cultures. I would say these same patterns that appear with humans tend to appear on larger scales as well, in a way that's difficult to really explain, since obviously larger cultures aren't biological, right? They shouldn't necessarily have the scaling ability that we often do see, but we often do see it. We see that large groups of humans that work together tend to operate like a very large human. So when two large communities interact, they often operate like two humans interacting, especially with larger scales when you look at the larger picture. Which is a really cool phenomenon. I'm sure there's a word for it, but I would not know it. So basically like freedom of association. Communities are free to physically remove people who they think would ruin their community. Open borders so everyone is able to move into every community they want, and also the now. If a community were to invade another community, the other communities would invade that aggressive community. Really hard to explain, cap off the dome. I usually reference books for exact definitions. This is my first time just freelancing it. That kind of sounds like what you're describing with the UN. Obviously, the communities are quite large in that case, but like not really passing laws per se, but just kind of managing things. And it's kind of like an agreement between these different communities. Napping the non-aggression principle, that's right. I don't know, like on one hand, like I said, this sort of like agreement between communities, but not necessarily making laws over each other, is very like UN coded. If you don't have like an actual governing body and you just try to have it be like agreements between peoples, then like I think historically you've seen that doesn't really add up to much. I think people tend to just kind of walk over that stuff if we're not actually making these groups and we're not actually like bringing our people together and making laws and trying to make changes that affect the larger group. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that. I do like the idea of, like, say you've got America, right? And you've got all the different states, which are supposed to be the main powers, even though the central government has really just become its own government and, like, the overarching thing, and states are kind of falling into the backside, which is unfortunate. People don't really care if you just have, like, these agreements, these non-aggression principles between people, perhaps because there's not enough, like, skin in the game, as it were. They're not part of these governments. They're not directly affecting each other. They're not making laws with each other. And while I don't necessarily like that, like I was saying with the US, I think there's a lot that like the national government does that it probably shouldn't do, that should just be up to states, because states are supposed to be the main powers. But at the same time, there are good things about it. There's not a whole lot of threat of like states attacking each other, right? Or like going to war with each other, certainly. I mean, I wouldn't say they like each other necessarily. There's certainly a lot of feelings a lot of states have towards a lot of places. As a Californian, I can speak from quite a bit of experience with that. As much as I like the idea of actually leaving it to the little communities, I think historically we've seen that doesn't turn out super well. My favorite story of these wars is how the Danish thought winter would make the Swedes calm down a bit, because bad weather. Also, the sea between them froze to ice, so no boats. King Charles X Gustav thought this was perfect. Now they can walk over the sea and attack instead. Second Northern War, 1658. That is pretty awesome. The sea freezes over, we can't use our boats. I mean, what did we have before boats? Just fucking send our soldiers over and just trash them. That is a pretty awesome story. It's quite a successful move, yeah, I imagine. The biggest big issue with any type of anarchism is a state will always form, yeah. A state will always form, and when it doesn't, you said it yourself, right? Anarchism. Things will kind of fall apart, and things won't end super well. What do you mean I'll calm down? Now I can literally walk you. Awesome, Mr. Light. I think the most radical libertarian government that can form is minarchism, which I'm not super familiar with. Anarchy will never last, yeah, because there will always be people who want to have more power, right? Who want to coalesce power, and people are strong when they're in a group, right? Apes strong together. So if you have this anarchy and you try to actually make this a system, which is kind of a, I mean, it's already kind of contrary to itself, right? But if you have this thing where you try to have this be anarchy, people will form groups because people are stronger in groups. And groups will come together then because now everyone is in groups. So once everyone's in groups, they're basically like individuals. So now the groups have to group together in order to face off against the groups who are grouping together. And then, like you said, Living Dog, you've got a state, right? All of a sudden. If we tried to go back to anarchy, we would literally just repeat history, just with a lot more technology and probably more nukes. I think the best thing we can do right now is just wait for AI to become intelligent enough to just take the reins of political power, and we just step back and just become pets. That's my stance. That's my stance. I'm a simple man. The event of the war is known as March Across the Belts. Scania, that was probably the most mixed region of Sweden. Learning a lot about Scandinavia here. Perfect timing to get into Vinland Saga. But isn't it the same if you allow private property? Instead of state having power, it would be wealthy individuals. No, a wealthy person owning things would be bad if he creates a monopoly, but I'm an anarcho-capitalist, so I think monopolies are formed by state intervention. And if they do ever form without the state, they won't last. So you think the monopolies that exist right now are formed by state intervention? I would say they were largely fueled by state intervention, but I wouldn't say they were formed by it. I guess it also depends on like your definition of monopoly. Like, you could technically argue Google doesn't have a monopoly on search engines because there's like Bing and stuff, but realistically it does. And I don't think there's a whole lot of arguments that the state was very impactful in that becoming a monopoly. I don't think that's really related to states. I think that's just a matter of, in the similar things that create states, like having these companies, right? And having companies rise to the top and basically fuel themselves. I think that in itself creates monopolies, and I don't think states really need to be involved. And that also does beg an interesting question. If you do have an anarcho-capitalist society, what does happen with like these things that aren't necessarily technically states, but like very large, like these companies, like these private states practically, right? Like obviously Google or Nvidia aren't states themselves, but if you like try to break down governments and you have the sort of anarcho-capitalist world, didn't the US have to introduce antitrust laws to specifically disband monopolies because there were no laws against it before? Yes, but monopolies that they did disband were already on the way down. I wouldn't call them a monopoly. I mean, again, I think it all really boils down to what your definition of monopoly is. If you want to like take the strict definition and say specifically like people who have no competition, if you have the sole provider for service, like I said with Google, technically it doesn't have a monopoly of search engines, right? Like there's like Bing and other things, but for all intents and purposes, it effectively has a monopoly. It doesn't actually have competitors, as it were. You can say like Microsoft Edge, but let's be honest, who really uses that? It's basically just Google. So you have these non-monopoly monopolies, right? That basically control the world. They don't fit as monopoly technically, but practically speaking, they do. Don't yet this exploitation should be ended by strikes isn't only because of our culture. People should be striking right now across the world, yet they aren't. Yeah, I can agree with that, Living Dog. You don't need a monopoly to exploit workers, right? You don't need a monopoly specifically where you have a single provider for a service to have all the effects of a monopoly. And you do need a state to like manage that power, right? I don't think many of us will argue that states who are like trust busting, like, you know, good old Roosevelt, I don't think there are many people who will argue he shouldn't have done that until it became a monopoly, right? It's good that he kind of asserted himself and actually stemmed the power of these things. And now you see, like, in the present day, right? I mean, you've got the current American president, right? Donald Trump, who's, like, getting cozy with all these private companies, and you are seeing their power increase exponentially. So I think the state has a lot of responsibility, has a lot of power when it comes to these private companies. Trying to disassemble the state without really addressing the companies, the private governments, if you would, feels like a recipe for disaster to me. No anarchism is realistic. I'd wish that realistically we can make any form of anarchism, even if it's something like anarcho-communism, simply because I just hate the state, but they are not really achievable. I mean, that's kind of like a lot of people's stance on like things like capitalism too, right? I don't think there are very many people who actually love capitalism, except for the highly successful capitalists. But we also all kind of just admit that we don't really have a better solution at the moment. So even though we don't like it, we're kind of just working with what we got, right? We're kind of just working with what we got, with the best thing that works. And if we get lucky, maybe we can find something in the future, but I wouldn't hold our breath. Especially with something similar to anarchism, which hasn't really been tried, and I would argue for good reason in history. Not that I don't see some benefits of it, especially given how poorly states have done, all things considered, but I don't know if, like, getting rid of the state is necessarily the right answer. I think my anarchism is more so fueled by the fact that I have not been pleased by the state. I can honestly say I've been grieved by it or the institutions that have fueled it so. I'd prefer any form of anarchism, even one with no government, than any of what we have today. I mean, obviously, Living Dog, I can't comment on, like, your experiences, right? I can't comment on what the like state has done to you. I mean, I think we all have shared experiences of being wronged by the government or governments. Not to invalidate your experiences, it's a common theme in humanity to have a particularly bad experience with something like a form of government or with government itself. Or like my grandparents on my mom's side and my mom herself actually fled from Vietnam during the Vietnam War. My grandfather fought in the Vietnam War for the South Vietnamese as a pilot, so fought directly with the US military. He got him and his family basically first-class tickets out of Vietnam. However, since they were running from communism, obviously once they arrived to America, they ended up having a heavy bias, not just against communism itself, which basically tore their country apart, But basically through like liberal and progressive ideology entirely, they were kind of soured to the entire thing, and now they're quite heavily conservative because of what extreme progressivism, right, like communism, did to their country. So it's a very real thing to like be wronged by a certain political system or like by a government, like you said, by the state. And it's very natural and understandable to harbor certain feelings about it, right, and become disillusioned by it and say like anything is better than this. At the same time, I think it's exactly that kind of thinking, the thinking that anything would be better than what we've got right now because of how badly they treated me, that leads to absolutely horrible things happening, right? Most dictators who have ever come to power, especially in the modern era, came to power because they weaponized that same feeling of discontentment, right? The feeling that anything would be better than what we've got now. Dictators feed off that stuff, right? They see something that people are unhappy with. Anything would be better than what we have now, and he says, I will fix it. And he says all these things that are like concerning, and people kind of look over it because it's something better than what they have now. It's something other than what they have now, and anything would be better than now. It just feels dangerous to me to see something that is clearly wrong, and I think there's a lot wrong with states. I think you're right, they've, like I said, wronged a lot of people. And I think we all have shared experiences of being wronged by governments and by states and by overarching power. But concluding that any form of anarchism would be better than this because of how bad it is, I think underestimates how much worse our situation could be without states. Especially in the modern world where we have so many like private states, right? We have these companies that are maybe not monopolies, but for pretty much all intents and purposes are. I don't think any form of anarchy, except for one that like dismantles the power of private corporations, would put us in any better of a position, if not just in a worse position. There sure are plenty of examples of states not deserving their existence. Truer words have never been spoken, my friend. It's not really my experiences, it's more so that I've been convinced that the state will always commit these wrongdoings through ANCAP literature, and now I've been reading a lot of political ideologies, and I've just become more convinced in my anarchism. I guess first I would ask you what kind of wrongdoings you're specifically referring to, but I mean, I think to a degree, yes, like any group of people given enough power will commit wrongdoings, right? Will do certain things with that power. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. But I mean, you could argue the same thing with like police. I guess you could very much make the argument that we shouldn't have police either. I think a lot of people make that argument. But like, given the opportunity, like, yeah, states will do certain things, right? States will do certain bad things, and they will take advantage of the power they have. But as you've said, it's kind of inevitable, right? Even if we switched back over to some sort of anarchical system, and like if somehow like we could make the entire world like states just dissolve, like if we couldn't do that, then obviously any anarchical or even like borderline anarchical state would be like, or non-state would be absorbed by actual states, right? Big eat small. Big fuck small, as the saying goes. If we were somehow able to press a magic button and just dissolve states entirely, like in the world, is there a world, is there a future where they don't just revert and like become states again? I don't think there is. I don't think there's a way we can put that genie back in the bottle, and I would argue that maybe there was never really a genie to put back into the bottle. It's just the nature of survival, right? Of existence. That if we were to divide it into small communities, then the communities would eventually seek a way to overpower the other communities. What's the best way to overpower communities? Well, by forming allegiances with other communities, right? You form allegiances with other communities, and all of a sudden, if you don't form an allegiance with another community, then you will be absorbed by communities, or the duo communities, the group communities. So everyone forms groups and forms these communities of communities. And then everyone's equal again. So now you have to forge alliances with other alliances. And then you have to keep doing that, and you build yourself up. And if it sounds like I'm reading a history book to you, it's because I am. Obviously, that's just the history of civilizations, right? It's just how things happen, because it's obviously how things happen. Admittedly, I'm not super well educated or well researched on things like anarchy and like anarcho-capitalism. But from how you're describing it, if it does sound like it actually has potential solutions to the problems that we see with states, then at best, it would seem to me to be in the similar boat as communism, right? It's not really achievable because, as one of my favorite comedians of all time, Jimmy Carr, says, right idea, wrong species. Humanity is the wrong species to try to actually realize these idealistic forms of government, these idealistic political concepts, because they will always be used and abused. The book that brought me into anarchism was Anatomy of the State, which I pirated about 3 years ago now. For legal reasons, that's of course a joke. At a fundamental level, I like the idea of like reverting and like going back to like smaller communities, like potentially just using the example we had earlier in the stream of cities. It is nice the idea that like we just have local governments, right? Local rule. And just kind of like do your thing, don't do like heinous crimes, you're fine. But if you do heinous crimes, we might like kick you out. And like ideally we don't like go war with each other, right? We just kind of do our own thing. And I guess we trade with each other. Even then, like even in an ideal world, that doesn't really work, right? Resources will always be an issue. We will always go to war and struggle over resources. Yes, we could have like trade systems between these communities, but we would always inevitably want more. And we would feel like we're getting the short end of the stick. I mean, it's a state example, but again, just look at President Donald Trump, who is saying that the world order that the US created is exploiting it. Like, people will always feel like they're getting the bad end of the deal. And that's where that conflict comes from, right? And not because war is in our nature, but because a desire for more is in our nature. I just don't see a world where humans could really achieve anything resembling anarchism. I think if we were looking for like an ideal world, I would actually argue that would be more in the direction of a universal government rather than a dissolution of governments. Like if you had to do one or the other, I would argue it's more practical and more possible to achieve a better world through a universal government rather than a dissolution of governments. Because a dissolution of governments is basically just a mess waiting to happen. Whereas a universal government, while it would be far from easy and far from clean, actually has the chance to get everyone basically on the same page. And as I've mentioned with like the US, right? It has kind of, like if you look at the US with the initial like 13 states, right? They were not very happy with each other. They were very much their own powers. And the US government didn't really exist. It was basically just the states coming together and talking, right? It wasn't really a government on its own. Flash forward to the Civil War. There's far more states, right? And they're still very not happy with each other because they have a civil war. Crazy how that happens. They're not really happy with each other, and there's like all this conflict, right? As the United States history has gone on, it has grown more and more powerful, and I certainly have my own thoughts about that, as I think pretty much every American and even a lot of non-Americans do. We have our own thoughts about the national government steadily drowning out state governments over the course of history. But one thing you can't really argue with is the conflict between states has all but disappeared. That's not to say the animosity has disappeared, right? That is the furthest thing from the truth. Citizens of states have very strong feelings about other states. Just look at like how a Floridian would talk about a Californian and vice versa. But there's no like conflict anymore, right? The stronger the national government has gotten, the less in conflict the states that it governs over get into conflict, right? Because the government is stronger and it's not ruling with an iron fist. At least for most of the modern history, the federal government hasn't like forced states to stop fighting with like military threat. It's just made us feel a stronger sense of connection with each other through the national government becoming stronger. We feel more bonded with each other. And going back to, again, earlier in the stream, that's what I was talking about with the EU, right? It's far from perfect, but it's done a lot of good. It's been a good example of people who, by all means, shouldn't really be getting along, gotten along to a much greater degree than I think a lot of people thought possible. My issue with a global government is that the second we get a bad leader, we are fucked, and also it's a one-way lane to government overreach. Democracy and the rule of law should act as brakes for like a government that tries to overreach. My defense of that point and also my counter to that point are both one and the same. that would be the current government of the US, right? Like, there is a lot of governmental overreach, like an absurd, almost comical amount of governmental overreach going on right now. And you could argue, yes, it's currently breaking down, democracy's breaking down. You could also argue that it is democracy itself that is keeping things from breaking down as quickly as they would. So I think the present situation the government is in both supports Mr. Light's point and also Living Dog's point. The second we get a bad leader, things get really bad, right? And admittedly, we kind of do it to ourselves. We kind of summon this bad leader in we vote him in, right? And if we have this unified like world global government, it would be like representative, right? A representative republic. We'd vote them into power. We would have to hope there are enough reasonable people to keep making reasonable decisions and vote reasonable people in, which is not something I think, at least I'm speaking for myself, I don't have a whole lot of confidence in. What I do have more confidence in is the ability of people to recognize that if there is a bad leader and if things are going very badly, I don't think that it's a game over screen if a bad leader gets elected. And I think historically you've seen that. I think pretty much every, if not every nation that currently exists has had a bad leader get elected, right? Historically, like, that is not necessarily the end. So I don't think that necessarily is a point against having a global government. Not that I would advocate for such a thing, but I think if we had to do one extreme or the other, that's the one I would be leaning towards. UN could do so much more if not for the goddamn Security Council. That's fair, that's fair. I have some issues with democracy in general. More so, I believe meritocracy is better than it. Not that it's bad, but just that I'd prefer other form of governments. We're talking about elections, right? We're talking about voting. So rather than democracy giving everyone the right to vote, it would be like giving a right to vote of people who like rate it, like people who like through merit have earned the right to vote through some means or another. I assume that's what you're referring to here as a meritocracy, not the more general use of the term, as in like just a world where those who like a merit-based system or a merit-based society, right, where people with merit succeed. I assume you're referring to the voting power. And assuming you are, until you clarify in the chat, I really don't like the idea of a meritocracy. I really don't like the idea of like merit-based voting or of any sort of prescriptive voting at all. And the main reason for that is just historically what has been the case. And one of my most recent like hottest takes that like I have about how the current world, how the current like voting works, at least in America, the idea that people under the age of 18 shouldn't be allowed to vote, I think that is ridiculous, and I think people under the age of 18 should absolutely be allowed to vote. Because if you look at all the reasons why we don't allow children to vote, it's something really funny happens when you apply a historical lens to it. Every single reason we have for not allowing minors to vote are reasons that were previously applied to why women shouldn't be able to vote. So if it were up to me, then we would basically just abolish the voting limit itself. So I am basically the furthest person from thinking like we should add stipulations to voting. Though it does sound like you're not actually talking about that. You're talking about individuals being granted power off their merit, like leader would be the most competent leader, not exactly feasible. Yeah. I mean, again, they're just like general ideas with not really any practical application, right? Because there's no way to grant power to people off of merit, right? There's not really a feasible way we can do that. There's several different problems with that. For one, what if the person who is most qualified simply does not want it? You can say we can go to the next person, or we can like find a bunch of people. Maybe we can find a bunch of people, and then whoever is the most qualified will rule. That's just elections, right? That's just what we have. So I'm not entirely sure like what a meritocracy that you're talking about would actually look like in the present world that isn't basically just a representative democracy or republic like what we have in the US. We can all agree total democracy is bad. Yeah, pretty much. I don't like giving people who are not educated the ability to make such large decisions on the nation, even though they have every right to. I don't like that idea. And yes, I realize I'm saying that in the same sentence that I said that we shouldn't restrict who is able to vote. But like, again, it's kind of the best thing we've got, right? I don't think what we have in America is the best thing we've got. I think we see a lot of cases in Europe of a better case. of a better situation. I think total democracy, where like in the sense where everybody votes directly for like their leader, I think that is better than like the electoral college, than the republic that we have, the democratic republic that America has, because I think that's ridiculous. I think we've proven how ridiculous it is through things like gerrymandering, right? And through things like districting. I think we've proven that electing people to represent us in like elections is a horrible idea and has not worked out for us. So when comparing total democracy to a democratic republic like the US has, I would choose a total democracy, because that allows more of the like actual vote to come through, and not just, and it isn't as dependent on where you live, right? However, I think even better than that, even more important than that, would be taking a lesson from the Europeans and having like preferential votes, right? Like how things often work in a lot of parliaments, and I believe Germany still works like this. It's not just black and white, right? It's not just I'm voting for this, I'm not voting for this. There are a bunch of candidates, and you actually have a larger spectrum of which you can vote with. So it discourages the two-party system that we've fallen into. If you have multiple parties and it's not just winner takes all, then smaller parties can be allowed to exist and allowed to start populating the government and do things like that. If there's one thing the Europeans have done much better than Americans, it's figure out how to democracy, I would say. The idea that it ought not to happen, but it should, is basically my entire view of law when it's nothing's that violate the NAP. I think drunks are bad, but they should be totally legalized. I phrased that wrong. Not that it should happen, but it should be able to happen. Yep, I think to a large degree I can agree with that. I do think that we've historically seen over and over again that the more illegal you make something, the more and more it sinks into the black market and the more powerful it becomes. I think we've seen that historically. So yeah, rather than just trying to stop drugs by making them illegal, I think most of us, if not all of us, would agree that it'd be a lot better to actually address why people are taking drugs, right? Like mental health and stuff like that, rather than just trying to say, you can't do that anymore, you're punished if you do it. Yeah, congratulations, you just made drugs far more profitable, right? Also, what's y'all's views on taxes? I could have sworn you wanted to watch the NBA or something, living dog. I mean, taxes is its own can of worms, right? Taxes is its own can of worms. No, man, I gotta stick through the stream. You say you gotta stick through the stream, but here you are actively trying to drag on the stream by bringing out these things that are you're just opening up you're just zipping open your backpack and just pulling out cans of worms to open up. When you've got taxes, right? I'm split. This bot stream is just gonna be anarchism and economics. It had to happen at some point, right? On one hand, I think people would be a lot more okay with taxes if the governments were transparent about where that money was going. I think most of the money from taxes is going towards things that are beneficial. We just don't see it because there's not enough transparency about where our money is actually going, and there's not a good breakdown of where taxes are going. And Alex is just sneaking in here. I think they're not so bad as long as they're well balanced to use, which they're not. Yeah, we'll get into that, Alex. I would say you just came in right at the end, but given that Living Dog just brought up taxes, who knows when the stream will end. Initially, on the surface level, it shouldn't be bad. It shouldn't be an issue. As long as you are transparent with your citizens and say where your money is going, and you say, like, you have a clear website, a government website, it's like, this is your money, this is how much of your money goes into this is where this money is going. I think the vast majority of people who are against taxes right now would not be as against taxes anymore. Because the biggest issue is that we just don't know where our taxes are going, right? We don't know where our money's going. And like, if you really dig around, you can find it, but it's not an easy thing to find. On the other hand, if our government was transparent about our taxes and where our tax money was going, it would become immediately clear to anyone it's not immediately clear to that a lot of our money is not going into where it should. I don't think it even counts as a conspiracy theory anymore that the amount of money that we pay into the government that is like disappearing like a magic trick is staggering. I mean, just the fact that the DoD, I believe, has never once passed an audit, a financial audit, is terrifying. So I guess in that regard, that's again another point for I think the best thing we can do with taxes, at least right now, is just full transparency. The government shows us exactly what's happening with our money. Because I think that would expose the fact that a lot of our money is just randomly disappearing and there's no accountability for it. And once that's in the public space, I think that will become apparent and things will start to change. Now, the longer conversation is whether we should be putting our money into the government at all, or we should just funnel that money into what needs it, i.e. hospitals, schools, daycares, charities, things like that. Whether we should trust the government to better those things, infrastructure, or whether we should just do it ourselves as communities. And I've got a sneaking suspicion, Living Dog, I know your stance on this, whether you'd rather have the money go into government to fix communities or whether you'd have the communities do it themselves. I've got a sneaking suspicion I know your stance on this. And I don't necessarily disagree with it. I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea to leave it in the hands of communities. At the same time, I think we overestimate the ability and willingness of communities to take that money and do good with it. I think if we were to give all the money that we're giving to the government and just give it to local communities, I think we would see the same thing that's happening in the federal governments, because it is, right? Money that is going into cities are also disappearing. So I don't think the corruption and the disappearance, quote unquote, of money would stop. We just left it in the hands of communities. And if nothing else, we would actually give more opportunity for people in charge, like mayors, to embezzle and disappear, do their Houdini tricks on our money. I'd rather taxes be voluntary, actually. I'm a massive libertarian, bro. I'm surprised you said I'd rather taxes be voluntary, rather than just stop taxes altogether. I am curious why you would rather have taxes be voluntary, because I think, unlike legalizing drugs, I don't think making taxes no longer obligatory would make people more willing to engage with them. I think the second you say you no longer have to put all this money into helping other people, people would stop giving their money to other people. Stopping taxes altogether would be a restriction on the government. I mean, yeah, obviously it would be, right? It would be a massive restriction. That's where they get most of their money from. I figured that's what you were looking for. You were trying to restrict the government. At the same time, I'm curious why you think you could make taxes voluntary and not effectively stop funding the government, because I think practically that's what would be the outcome of that. I think most public services should be private, really, though, so taxes would be less needed. So rather than give money to smaller governments like cities, you'd rather give that money to corporations. I guess you mean I think most public services should be private services. So are you talking about things like daycares, education? You think those should be private? I don't think privatization is necessarily a good idea, because turning things private is effectively the same thing as changing things into being profit-centered, right? The vast majority of private services would be for profit, because most people can't afford to make a non-profit. And I don't think changing a lot of public services public parks, infrastructure, education, a lot of hospitals, we see it already with privatization. I don't think that's a good idea, because I don't think people do much better with this responsibility than governments. The best way to make profit in a culture where workers strike and where there's healthy competition would be good services. If people demand more and boycott corporations as well, if there's not good enough service, they will be forced to change. Spoken like a libertarian. But those are pretty strong ifs, aren't they, Living Dog? They shouldn't be, but they are. Just look at Amazon. Obviously, there's a lot we could do better about Amazon. But, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to boycott Amazon? Sure, you can try. I've seen over just this past year alone, a lot of people have tried boycotting Amazon, stopping using it, but it is such a powerful service. And take Google, Amazon, these foundational functional monopolies, you can't really boycott them without taking massive, like, personal sacrifice. Even if you could convince that many people to go through such a big sacrifice to try to put the corporation in check, they are so successful that they can just wait it out. They can just wait it out and let the let the consumers choke themselves out and not really change anything. Amazon is such a good example of why libertarian free market economics are just not possible, because we let these corporations get so big by not forcing better wages and treatment of workers. And like the same thing applies to governments, right? Everything you're saying about private companies, like we should be able to, like, we should boycott them, right? And demand better wages and things like that. Like, we have the power over private companies, right? We should. We're the consumers. We give them money. But all of those arguments also apply to the government. Government officials work for the public. All of those arguments should work for governments just as much as private companies. And I think it's very interesting and telling of our modern day that we say customers have a lot more say over private companies than citizens do over their government. Even though the role of both are functionally the same, the feeling of disconnect with, like, people and their governments is so strong that it doesn't feel like the same anymore. The problem is who manages the money, whether it's private or public. Always people with their own interests, and that unfortunately is the human error. Personally, I don't care who has the money as long as they are competent in what they do based on past actions, even if they mismanage a portion of the money. I agree and disagree, Alex. The first statement I agree with fully. I think 100%, like, it doesn't matter if it's private or public, it's always going to be, at the end of the day, people in power managing money, right? And if you trust private people to manage money better than public, I think that just speaks to how little we trust public power. But I don't think that delineation is as strong as we like to think it is. However, I disagree that as long as they're competent in what they do, I don't care if they have the money, even if they mismanage a portion of it, because I don't think we should meet halfway there, right? I don't think we should say, as long as they're doing a good job, we should, I don't care if they mismanage part of the money. Like, it shouldn't be a compromise we need or even care to reach. Like, if you're competent but you're mismanaging my money, then I'm sorry, you're not really competent. I'm not happy with that. Mismanagement of money, I think, is one of the biggest things. Like, that is like a deal breaker of competence. I think state has an edge compared to companies in the sense that because there's a guaranteed turnover, the system is designed well. That's one big distinction between private and public, in the sense that private can kind of do whatever it wants. Public power is bound by the rules that formed it, right? Like the Constitution in the US. It's bound by term limits, right? It's bound by elections. Private companies are not. Also, one big flaw of capitalism is it assumes absolute freedom and coverage of information. Yeah, definitely, which there very much isn't, right? And the more power someone has, the more ability they have to limit the passage of information and knowledge with the public. My personal hot take, advertising should be illegal. That's a whole other can of worms, Mr. I'm sorry, I'm not going to open that one. It shouldn't be this way, but unfortunately it will happen. But Centerman says 7.3 is still something good. If we want to avoid problems, we'll have to use AI in the end. Even that is not 100% safe. I concur with that, Alex. I think at the end of the day, most of these problems we're going to have to leave to AI, whether we like it or not. And whether it'll end well or not, I think if there's any solution to the problems that we currently have, it'll be in the AI's hands, because I think as humans, we've thought about it pretty much as we can think about on our own. I think we've really got to leave it to bigger minds at this point, even if that ends up us becoming the pets of AI. That's just how it is, and that's just, it is what it is. Thank you all for watching. Have a great night. Have a great morning, day, night, living dog. And until the next one, have a lovely rest of your day.